For those of you who don't know, the VLGA has just elected a new president. So it is my pleasure to introduce Councillor Denise Massoud, who is the VLGA's president for the next 2 years.
Congratulations, Denise.
Hey, well done, Denise.
That's fantastic.
Thank you, everybody. The VLGA acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. I'd just like to welcome everybody. It's lovely to see so many faces still coming together. I think we all need that. It adds to a bit of enjoyment and spark for the day. And so I really thank you all for coming along today. I think it's a little sad that we didn't get down to Mornington, and I'll have to come down and visit Despy and Sarah, the Mayor and Deputy Mayor, at some stage. But yeah, it's still lovely that we're still all here today because it's such a good purpose. And I'm now going to hand across to Deborah Wu to take us through the agenda, I guess, and for the meeting. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you to everyone for coming along today. We have such a great mix of councillors across the state, so that's really lovely to see. And if you want to pop in the chat the traditional owners of country from where you're zooming in from, that would be lovely, and we can sort of see that nice spread across the state. With that, though, I am going to hand over to Lula, who is the Manager of Gender Equity at Women's Health in the Southeast, who have very kindly, well, she has very kindly volunteered her time today to speak to us about some of the strategies that you might be able to employ when you're encountering backlash and resistance to gender equity initiatives. So with that, I'll hand over to Lula and I will start to share my screen so that you can see her slides.
So I would also, on behalf of Women's Health in the South East, like to acknowledge that we are meeting on unceded Aboriginal land. The land on which I am coming from today is the land of the people of the Kulin Nation. However, I do recognise that people are joining us from multiple places today, and we'll capture that in the chat. We recognise our Indigenous people's continuing connection to the land, waters and culture, acknowledging their elders past, present and emerging, and those who may be here today, and that Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We commit our organisation to truth listening, truth telling and bringing the Uluru Statement of the Heart to our hearts. So my name is Lula Dembele and I am Manager of Gender Equity at Women's Health in the South East. And today I'm here and we're going to talk about some strategies to overcome resistance and backlash to gender equity initiatives. What we're here today, the goals of what I want you to walk away with today is being able to recognise and name forms of resistance and backlash, understand the unique settings of politics that make it more likely or prevalent to occur in those settings, and be able to walk away with one or two very practical strategies about how we can seek to address or overcome resistance and backlash when we find it, particularly in our workplaces. The presentation today on approach is we're going to look at what is resistance, what does that look like at the political level. We're going to do a little exercise with you, which I hope you'll all join in. We'll be using a Jamboard for that, and I'll step you through how we're going to access it and use it in a bit. Why particularly does resistance to gender equity and equality occur in politics, the context of why it's relevant right now, the work happening under the Gender Equality Act, and what you can individually and collectively do. Starting with defining resistance and backlash. Backlash can be any form, backlash resistance is any form of resistance towards progressive social change. With regards to gender, backlash and resistance seeks to maintain and reinforce gender inequalities, and it is a subset of the many practices and processes which sustain gender inequality. The features of backlash and resistance, which I'd like you to particularly remember as we go through, is that this is really an inevitable, I should give myself less hard words to say when I'm presenting, inevitable response to social change. It can be seen at an individual level or a collective level. Structurally, resistance can be informal or formal. It can take part as organised backlash, and I think you're probably aware of that yourselves, or have experienced that yourself when you get men's rights activists attacking people online, or you feel like the system is really against you and not letting you in. Resistance is diverse, contextual, and historically specific. Resistance is more likely to come from the people who are advantaged by the status quo, and resistance contributes, as we've acknowledged before, to the maintenance of gender inequality. Looking at the forms of resistance that you might see and be familiar with, they range from your kind of more covert and subtle versions, which is your denial, so denial of the problem or the legitimacy of the case for change. There's no problem here. What are you talking about? Everything's fine. Disavowal, so refusal to recognise responsibility. It's not my job. I'm here to do this. Gender equality's over there, not my business. Inaction, refusal to implement change initiative. That's not a priority right now. We don't have resources. We're really stretched. There's a lot going on. Appeasement, efforts to placate or pacify those advocating for change in order to kind of limit its impact. So absolutely agree, gender equality is important. We must do something one day. Appropriation, so that's, simulating change while kind of covertly undermining it. Of course, we'd love to appoint more women, if only there were more who are qualified or experienced for the role. Co-option, using the language of progressive frameworks and goals such as equality, rights, justice, and so on for reactionary ends. So, that's the kind of whataboutism element. So what about men's rights? Men are victims too. What are we doing about men's suicide and various things? Whenever you try to think about specific and particular goals to increase women's equality. Repression, reversing or dismantling a change initiative. We tried that once, women didn't take it up, they didn't come for the promotions, we didn't get enough women who were interested. The one woman we got, well, she was a troublemaker, she didn't really work out with us. And then through to backlash, your aggressive attacking responses. Feminists deserve everything they get, this is man-hating, you're all a bunch of, what's the word that they like to use? Misandrists and the like. So I've, been, by the virtue of, I guess, the March for Justice and various things that happened this year, I had this wonderful resource that we can call on to kind of start to look at resistance in politics. And I've got a video here that I've stolen, or borrowed rather, from Misrepresented, and I'm hoping we can listen to it. I think, Julie Bishop speaks to something that I'll reflect on later about strength in numbers in the first part, but then we start to hear and see what resistance can feel like when we're working in politics.
You are one of the few people in Australian politics who is in a position to observe the difference between being the only woman in a cabinet and being one of two or three and then one of more. How does that work?
It does make a difference. By the time Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister and we had maybe 5 or 6 women, there was just a sense of this is how it should be. There should be many more female voices around the table, exchanging views and ideas, a different life experience, different background, different perspective. It added to the richness of the debate.
And it sounds like even having another woman in your line of sight seems to have made a difference.
So that I could eye roll at them. Yes, that did help. Seriously. It's a phenomenon that I've described as gender deafness. And it occurs not only in the federal cabinet, but I've experienced it elsewhere. And so many women have told me they've experienced exactly the same thing.
It's one of those classic frustrations that we all have as women in politics.
You do a few eye rolls and you get the raised eyebrow.
It's extraordinary that it persists today.
Of course it's happened to me.
It's probably happened to you.
You're the only woman in a room and you come up with an idea or you say something.
And it's like no one hears you.
You are the only woman and you put up an idea and then they look at you
and go on debating.
And you think, oh, okay, that was a dud.
And then the next person speaks.
And suddenly, your idea,
It only has to get 2 or 3 chairs along.
Till the bloke says it.
And then the next one actually appropriates your idea.
Maybe in different terms, and say, oh. And everyone goes, oh, that's a great idea.
And then all the men around the table nod and say, what a good idea.
Hello, did I not?
Is there an echo in this room?
It's kind of astonishing when it does. You sort of think,
Didn't I say that?
I just said that.
And all of a sudden everybody heard it and it's a great idea.
Let's go around the room and everyone says what their opinion is. And we'll start with you. What do you think we should do? I said, well, I think we should do ABC. Male number 1. I agree with Anne. We should do ABC. Male number 2. I agree with male number 1. We should do ABC. Male number 3. I agree with males number 1 and 2. By the time we went around the room, they were all patting each other on the back for their wonderful idea that they came up with. This is the power of invisibility that we have.
This is not something that I've created. The number of women who've told me...
That happens all the time.
it's as if men in power, they still find it hard to accept that good ideas can come from women.
There are heaps of taken from that series though that you can find on YouTube, and I do have some others which speak to insults and various other forms that we could label as resistance and backlash if we've got time somewhere in this. So coming back to gender and politics, and some of the, we can speak a lot to all the ways that gender and sexism and gender inequality is demonstrated. I really wanted to bring it into your political setting because that's where you're working, and that's what we need to understand. Why is it likely that you're going to see it and maybe experience more of it, or experience even harder resistance in political settings? So, and to do that, we need to understand kind of where it starts. So the imbalance of power between men and women in politics is rooted in entrenched gender norms that impact women's access to skills and resources needed to seek and gain leadership roles and elected office. And I think we've seen now even those stereotypes and how they've come about in your settings about how will you look after your kids? Aren't you neglecting your family? And I found what I thought was really a relevant demonstration of the masculine and feminine stereotypes that spoke to leadership and politics particularly, and about why the masculine norm is associated with leadership. So that logical, rational, being aggressive. I mean, I know I don't quite know how it operates in council, but having worked in federal government for a long time and state government, you can see that that's really combative on the floor, tearing each other down, strips off each other, and in Parliament itself is a very aggressive kind of environment. Men are supposed to be strategic, independent and competitive, and they are the boss and decision maker, head of the household, head of the workplace. Whereas women, the other side, as we've seen again, women, you must be hormonal, intuitive, emotional, submissive, girly, but infantilizing, got it out that time. And also that idea that women are supposed to support their man. Behind every good man is a good woman, and our job is to be the faithful supporter, not the disruptor, not the leader, not the one asking the questions. So in many societies, it's still the case that power, and especially political power, is associated with that masculine norm. Based on this, it seems it's natural or normal that men hold 75% of seats in parliaments globally, serve as 79.5% of speakers in parliament, and represent 93.4% of heads of state. Men hold about 90% of leadership positions within political parties. The majority of civil society organisations are also led by men. Despite progress on women's political empowerment in recent years, it will take us 95 years to achieve the goal of gender parity in global politics. And that takes us to politics, men's business. At the institutional level, political parties are unwelcoming to female members and leaders in many aspects of their day-to-day operations, procedures, and internal cultures. As we saw with Misrepresented, the many subtle and overt ways that women are silenced. Brittany Higgins, her being given a pamphlet to say deal with this, and the foremost concern being how it would impact the political party to have rape allegations revealed during an election. The examples that you've provided just go on and on and on and on. So political institutions, including parties and parliaments, have been shaped by male norms and masculine codes of behaviour. Political parties were established as male membership institutions, and their internal workings reflect the persistence of gendered norms and roles found in our societies. Men, particularly privileged men, monopolise political leadership. I'd really like to see more diversity in our male leaders, but also, of course, our female leaders across the board. Practically, at the organisational level, government ministries and elected bodies are often not family-friendly environments, and they're structured not for the reality of women's lives. So we've got, this persistent sort of socio-cultural idea that politics is viewed as men's business, and the prevailing attitude we've seen, at least in our federal politicians, is that basically if women can't handle the combative, tough nature, hard drinking workplace, then they aren't up to the task. Not that there's anything wrong with the behaviour, but simply women aren't good enough or capable of doing it, toughing it out. Media coverage of women, in politics focuses on what we wear, marital status, if they happen to have an empty bowl of fruit in their kitchen, the tone of our voices, rather than looking at, our policy positions or our competence to do the job. And moreover, as women have emerged as activists, elected leaders, officials and voters, they are encountering increasing levels of harassment, intimidation and psychological abuse in person and also increasingly online. So as noted before, it's going to take 95 years to achieve the goal of gender parity in global politics at the rate we're going now. As of 2019, Australia tied 48th in the world with Angola and Peru for female representation in politics. The good news is that Victoria local governments are really leading the way with their 50-50 target. Almost there. I understand we're at 44%. Is that correct?
Yes, we're technically 43.8, but that's 44.
Won't hold that against you. Round it up. It's nice whole number. So, as we can see, essentially, what happens when we encounter this backlash is it discourages women from engaging politically. We see many women in surveys nationally that we simply opt out. We look at what's going on in politics and we're just like, I'm not up for that. I don't want to be exposed to that. So that creates a serious barrier to our ability to freely and safely pursue our rights in political participation, and it actually undermines democracy and particularly the effectiveness of our policies and strategies to create more equitable societies, because we just don't have the representation that allows that lived experience to be put into policies that allow greater engagement, greater involvement, and really reflect the dynamics and the diversity of the Australian population's lives. And why I think this is going to be something, even for those who I've heard say, you're doing really well as far as having a gender balance amongst the councillors. There is the context of the Gender Equality Act, which is coming into play right now. It was obviously came out last year and came into effect on the 31st of March this year. And this is important because the Act requires defined entities, including public sector organisations such as councils, to take positive action towards achieving workplace gender equality and promote gender equality in their policies, programs and services. This includes developing and implementing a gender equality action plan for every 4 years, undertaking a workplace gender audit. And I want to draw your attention here to Indicator 2, which is addressing the gender balance of governing bodies. So for councillors, that is yourselves. And undertaking gender impact assessments. So whether directly involved or not, these questions about gender, how it affects your work, how you are representing gender in your leadership positions, all of this is going to be much, much, much more frequent and coming across your dials, including that to do the work of the Gender Equality Action Plan, a commitment of resources has to be put in place. So it's going to affect your budgets. This is something that's you're going to be looking at, and undoubtedly, this is going to raise those questions of why are we doing this? What's it for? So I think while the intent of the Gender Equality Act is brilliant and it's doing a lot of good work, I think at your level particularly, you're going to see a bit more resistance and backlash, potentially even where it wasn't before. And the reason for this is it actually starts to speak to the sources of backlash and resistance. So basically they come down to a few things. I'll come back to community advisory committees in a second. You can include those, but yes. So the sources of resistance and backlash are inertia, fear of change, and that is something that the Gender Equality Act is demanding, that we achieve change. Sexist and violent supportive attitudes, socialised sexism, particularly among men, but also women. Thank you. Thanks for adding that. The defence of privilege, so men's aggrieved entitlement, and as we just sort of spoke about, there's a really strong tie in politics between masculine identity, the role of leaders, and who should be doing this work. The denial of privilege, as well as the idea that we're in this post-feminist world with neoliberal norms. We've achieved gender equality. It's not a problem here. We've done it. What more do you want? So I think, you know, we have some clear implications for what that means for male political leaders and how they must understand that women's participation and leadership benefits the entire community, and that women's participation increases citizenship trust in government and other political institutions. So there's a great reason and call to action as to why we should be doing this at the local government level. Men and women must be both involved in championing reforms, because, you know, men 50%, women 50%, and I'm only talking about the binary here. I'm very conscious of that, as well as having inclusion of all people who identify with non-binary gender. But really, we need everyone to be involved if we're going to make the changes that need to be done. So I'm just trying to think, are there any particularly good examples of what happens in politics? So I think, you know, when we're taking to that privilege, men may understand that as more women get involved in politics, there'll be fewer positions for men, and that starts to come back to those questions about merit as well. Well, you know, why is she here? Is this, you know, just because it's a woman is getting that job? And they start to undermine the concepts of gender equality from questioning the merit of women who are going for political positions. Sexism, you know, we get that stuff about men not thinking that women aren't their equals and they don't deserve equal rights to participate fully in political life, coming back to those ideas about what a woman's role is and where she should be in the home, taking care of kids. And, you know, I think we might see a lot of this, particularly in the context of COVID and the other crises like climate action that we're asking people to focus on and commit to, is that men may support the idea of women's political participation and leadership, but believe that the current moment isn't right to push for this. There's so many priorities that we could be looking at, and why is this one what we need to do now? Or actually, some men may think this is just a fleeting moment. You know, we had Me Too, we had the March for Justice, and, you know, we've done that. You've had your moment in the sun and it's kind of over and dusted. People will get over it. It's kind of a dismissive attitude that we see. So what we're going to move into now is the strategies for what you can do. And as I said, I want to keep this really, really practical. And the first strategy that we've got is about keep it in perspective. And we've basically walked through that process in a way. While it feels very overwhelming to look at your amazing Jamboard and see all the examples that you have, what we have been able to understand through the process so far is that this form of resistance and backlash is a totally par for the course when you're doing any form of social change. So we just need to keep that in perspective. A lot of this comes from those sense of privilege or insecurity or scarcity of opportunity, that being taken away from people. And that's very natural when we're doing this work. So if we know that when we come to do the work of gender equality, there's going to be backlash, there's going to be resistance, and therefore it sort of takes some of the power out of it. If you can hear what someone says to you, like, you know, the ones about it not being the time, and that it's not a woman's role, just blatant sexism, or any of those kind of more trickier ways that people try to undermine it. Once we get this sheet back to you and we can identify what form of resistance is, when you can see it and name it and put it in its place, you really start to take some of the power out of it. You start to be able to understand, okay, well, this is what is going on in this moment. That doesn't mean that we don't keep going. It doesn't mean that it's a massive block to everything. It's just in its space of where it sits for the work that we're doing. So the second one we've got is staying curious. I find, and this is a personal practice of mine when I'm doing work engaging men, and when I'm talking about prevention of violence against women, anything to do with gender equality, you do get people who pipe up, who want to be the loudest in the room, or who feel genuinely aggrieved. And I think the best way I've learned to disarm that or hear those people is to literally, when they come up with a statement, ask the question, what is your concern? And get them to state further from that moment of kind of heightened anger or frustration or an outburst. Okay, what is your concern? That shows, one, that you're actually listening, because a lot of people just feel like they're being minimised or not heard or taken over. It gives them that space to be heard. If they're just being sexist, it's a bit tricky for them to unpack that in a meaningful way. They might have to trip over themselves and get over their blustering. But otherwise, you do start to understand and hear the insecurities or hear the depth or a personal experience that's shaping that resistance. And you can explore that in a more kind and empathetic way. And often that in and of itself starts to neutralise the resistance, because they're like, oh, we're not actually at odds. We're not actually here combating each other. There's space for me to be heard. And often when you get under it, you can then make that appeal to a universal value. That's like, well, everyone wants to be heard. I don't want anyone to feel left out, you know, and you give them the space to kind of diffuse the situation, get past that moment of anger or frustration and walk through onto what's next and stay focused on the goal. Strength in numbers is the third strategy I'd like to recommend to you. So what it's really good to understand, along with keeping resistance and backlash in perspective, is that men radically overestimate the sexist supportive attitudes of other men in the room and even other women. So this kind of bullying behaviour where you see them say really degrading things about women or just dismissive things about women is kind of based on this assumption that this is a norm. This is a widely held kind of belief that other people will back them in on, or that other people are too afraid to speak up against. So if you do have other women on your council, or if you know other men who are not sexist and support gender equality work, I think it's really valuable to have an explicit conversation, create a buddy system, create a backing up system, where if you encounter backlash, you have made an explicit agreement. One of us will say something and the other person will back them in. If you can demonstrate that there's a strength of numbers for people who don't agree with that attitude, who aren't supporting sexism, then that demonstrates that they're out of touch with the norm. They're out of touch with the values base in the room. And as humans, as creatures who like to connect, who like to find a sense of belonging, we know from values-based messaging, we know from social change efforts, what works is making an appeal to the norm. So if you can just demonstrate that that is an outlier view, well, then you actually again start to demonstrate this isn't acceptable and this isn't what's here. And it doesn't have to be an aggressive attack. It doesn't have to be anything that, escalates the situation. Again, coming back to that stay curious, maybe you could ask the question, what is your concern? And someone else could ask, yeah, actually, I would like to hear more about that. Or just say, that's not appropriate. Simple things like eye rolling, crossing your arms. There's lots of ways we can convey that that's not acceptable. So I would really encourage you to know who your partners in this work is, how you can actually demonstrate that there is strength in the numbers to overcome some of that more bombastic, really pronounced sexism, because that's the way that we demonstrate we don't support this and it's not accepted here. There are also some really great strategies emerging, particularly for how to engage in men power and politics. And I have included that on the resources. So if you wanted within your council or across councils through the VLGA to look at an actual strategy that it's talking specifically about mobilising men to engage in gender equality, men in politics specifically, then I've shared that resource here, and we can have that as an ongoing conversation either amongst yourselves, with WISE, through the VLGA. So if there's something longer term that you'd like to implement, then we can do that too. And I just want to go on to the resources and acknowledge the work that I have drawn from here today, which has been the Vic Health Encountering Resistance. That's where you can find all the information on the different forms of resistance and examples of what they are. We've got Engaging Men, Reducing Resistance, well, I've misspelt it, I can see, and Building Support, which is really aimed at practitioners like myself. There's lots of useful tips and tricks and strategies to use in that. The Men Power Politics program from the National Democratic Institute. And for people who are generally interested in how to do this work with men and boys, XY Online has just volumes and volumes and volumes of useful resources that you can find.